It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome, fellow Quillers, to an episode I have been promising you all for quite some time now, and well, it's finally here. Some time ago, I believe it was the summer of 2022, I received an email from Lev Verkhovsky, who listens to the podcast all the way from his home in Moscow, Russia. Lev shared with me some of his work on the Shakespeare authorship mystery, and some brief history of how the study of the mystery has been conducted in Russia since the late 19th century. He explained prevalent Russian thinking on the matter, and he helped me to see how societal and geopolitical differences in various parts of the world have affected the focus and direction of study of the authorship mystery. He also helped me to see that Shakespeare belongs to us all over the world. Shakespeare, whoever he was, isn't just an English playwright. He's a universal master who is revered by all. Though it has taken me a while to get to this episode, Lev deserves to be credited for also inspiring me to reach out to other Quillers around the globe, and that has resulted in some great episodes of the podcast, including those featuring guests such as Luis Sousa in Portugal, Luke Prodromou from Greece, and most recently, Philip Cooper up in Sussex, England. Each of these guests have offered a new and different perspective, new theories to consider, and new avenues of exploration to our great mystery. And I have said here before many times, all comers are welcome to the Quiller Nation. There are no levels of authorship skepticism recognized here. Every level is one step closer to the truth. To question at all puts you on a different level than most, and thank God for that. Regardless of where you are in your journey into this great mystery, as long as you believe there are significant questions to be asked and you are committed to finding the truth, we all believe that that truth must be somewhere beneath the myth of the Stratford man, then there must be a truth to be found. And welcome to you, fellow Quiller. Let's explore this mystery together. Lev, who also goes by Leversky, a combination of his first and last names, is a Rutlandian, which is not a term we have much used here on Don't Quill the Messenger in the past. Nonetheless, Roger Manners, the 5th Earl of Rutland, has been on the list of potential candidates for the true Shakespeare since the late 19th century, and in Lev's mother Russia, Rutland is still considered the top candidate among many a Russian researcher looking to solve the authorship mystery. Through the course of his own research, Lev published the Russian book known as, and forgive my Russian pronunciation here if I jerk this all up, but I believe it goes like this: Shakespeare Lika I Maski, which translated into English is Shakespeare, Faces and Masks. When Lev contacted me, he wrote to inform me that he had posted English translations of some of the articles he has written on this topic. I reviewed the contents and found myself very intrigued by the Rutland hypothesis and its history in Russia and other places. I responded to his email, as I promise all of you that I truly do respond to every email. It just sometimes takes me some added time to catch up. I'm not complaining. I love to receive your notes, comments, suggestions, and yes, your critiques via email. And this episode is proof that by choosing to write to me, you can have an influence on future episodes of this series. I wrote back to Lev, and I asked him to be a guest on the show. I offered to set up a Zoom recording session that would accommodate the difference in time zones between me on the west coast of the United States and he in Moscow, which is what I do for all of my international guests. And he responded, and I'd like to read you his response. He writes, "Dear Stephen, thank you so much for your good letter. You write," and he quotes me here, "I think it is important that we continue to consider all aspects of this question and encourage further research into all avenues." He says, "I completely agree with you and hope that a free exchange of opinions in the end will lead to the truth." He's a man after my own heart, this Lev Verkhovsky. He continues, "Unfortunately, I cannot accept your offer to take part in your podcast series in a future release. My knowledge of English is absolutely passive. I have not had any conversational practice." I guarantee you his English is far better than my Russian. And this is something that I truly believe has been lacking in authorship studies over the past 100 years. Research conducted by people who actually speak and or comprehend more than one language. I believe if we truly want to know the mind of Shakespeare, then we need to understand that he was constantly thinking in multiple languages: Greek, Latin, Italian, French, Spanish, German, and even a little Russian if we look at Love's Labour's Lost, for instance. Anyway, Lev finished his response with this: "I am sending you my little text, How I Became a Rutlandian. See attachment," and he did attach that document. "Please note that there is now an English translation of my 4th article, Hamlet, Changing of the Guard," and he provided a link which I will share with all of you on our social media pages. And then he closed with, "I wish you every success and let's keep in touch, Lev V." I responded to him and I asked, "Would it be all right with you if I summarized some of the details of your research for my listening audience and then shared the links to your English translations for my listeners to visit the site and read them for themselves?" And he replied, "That would be wonderful," he wrote. "Please act as you see fit. I think it is important that English-speaking researchers of the Shakespeare question read Gililov's book." We'll be talking a lot about Gililov in a few minutes. And Lev adds, "Even if they disagree with his concept, the book will significantly expand their horizons and the discussion of the problem will rise to a higher level." This man is a true quiller. He closed the note with, "Thanks again, Stephen. Best, Lev." And then he includes in parentheses, "I'm also a Veer, capital V-E-R, which are the first 3 letters of his last name, Verkhovsky." Ladies and gentlemen, I feel so fortunate to be in the quiller company of people such as Lev and Luis and Luke and Philip and most recently Michael Stepniewski and close to 80 different guests I have welcomed to this series, as well as the thousands of you out there all around the world who make the Quiller Nation what it is. Thank you. Thank you to those of you I call my loyal 17 listeners. It's a privilege to share this mystery with all of you, you few, you happy few. In sharing Lev's work with all of you, I will begin with his essay on why and how he became a Rutlandian. Lev indicates that he had no formal education in the humanities and that he had nothing to do with the Bard until 1997, when he read a first edition copy of the book, The Game About William Shakespeare, or The Mystery of the Great Phoenix, by the Russian researcher Ilya Gililov, which Lev says literally changed his life and plunged him into the authorship mystery. I think there are many of us here who can relate to that feeling of discovery when it comes to this topic. For some of us, it was a book. For others, perhaps a video. And for some of you, I'm humbled to know that it was the discovery of this podcast, which first introduced you to this great mystery. Gililov's book defends the view that the central role of Shakespeare was played by Roger Manners, 5th Earl of Rutland. And Lev points out that research into Rutland began as early as the end of the 19th century. By 1906, Rutland was proposed as a candidate for Shakespeare in print, which was a full 14 years before J. Thomas Loney proposed Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, as the prime candidate for Shakespeare. So that's an important note. Rutland was considered first by many long before, at least 14 years, and the evidence shows more than 20 years before Loney points to De Vere. By 1912, the idea of Rutland as Shakespeare quickly caught on in Germany, Belgium, and Russia. And here are some key reasons Rutland has stood out as a potential for being the face behind the Shakespeare mask. Roger's father, John Manners, died when Roger was just 11 years old. He would then become a ward of the court of Queen Elizabeth and would be raised in the household of, you guessed it, William Cecil. Does any of this sound familiar? The young lad was away at school when he learned of his father's untimely death and had to hastily return home for the funeral in a very Hamlet-esque sort of way. Not unlike Hamlet, the young Roger was considered to be a genius, and indeed he did receive his master's degree from Cambridge University at the age of 19, which was presented to him in a grand ceremony orchestrated by his very close friend, Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. We all know that name, don't we? In 1599, Roger married Elizabeth Sidney. Yep, you guessed it, daughter of Philip Sidney, and consequently, the stepdaughter of the Earl of Essex. The incestuous nature of these courtiers and earls, the Sidneys, the Dudleys, the Manners, the De Veres, etc. It was this keep it all in the family atmosphere during the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras, no doubt. Sadly, by all accounts, Roger's marriage to Elizabeth Sidney was not a happy one, with some doubting that the marriage had ever even been consummated. They never had any children that we're aware of, though there is an interesting painting that has been identified as Elizabeth Sidney, and it is a pregnancy portrait. So we're not sure whether it's really her or that's a mistake. It does look a lot like her. But nonetheless, they didn't have children that we know of, although what we do know is that doesn't really mean anything, does it, in Elizabethan and Jacobean times. Anyway, some spoke about Roger Manners having been impotent. Other rumors were that he was homosexual and refused to consummate the marriage because he had no interest in the female anatomy. Other rumors claimed that he had contracted syphilis during his journeys to the continent, which probably and ultimately ended his life at an early age. We'll talk about that later, but we'll get to that. In the meantime, let's focus on the fact that Roger did travel to most of the places necessary to have written the works of Shakespeare, including having spent a good deal of time at university in Padua, Italy. And we'll get back to that in a moment too. In 1601, Roger finds himself tangled up with his good buddies, the Earls of Essex and Southampton, in what would go down in history as the Essex Rebellion. Unlike the unfortunate Essex, and much more like the very fortunate Southampton, Roger Manners, 5th Earl of Rutland, survives the executioner's axe, and instead of death, is ordered to pay a £30,000 fine for his involvement in the affair. And that's around $30 million in today's money. That is a sizable sum. He very nearly went full broke, but his circumstances improved some after James I came to the throne, when suddenly Roger became a favorite of the king. Now, of course, this further fueled the rumors of Roger's homosexuality, especially since we know that James did enjoy his boy toys, not unlike Richard II. Oh, the tangled webs of these Elizabethans. It's like Game of Thrones without dragons. Anyway, Rutland just so happened to be the pupil of this guy named Francis Bacon. P.S. Another Shakespeare candidate who has been proposed over the ages. Remember that connection. It's important. In 1603, our pal Roger led an embassage to Denmark for James I. James' wife was a princess of that nation. So there was a strong relationship there. There had been a strong relationship between Denmark and Scotland before James took the throne of England. Roger was the man selected to go and be the courtier assigned to Denmark. There he reunited with his two schoolfellows that he had known from his time at university in Padua. Their names, you guessed it, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Pretty weird. You can't make this stuff up, ladies and gentlemen. Also noteworthy, in 1605, there was a very embarrassing and public display when Roger's wife, Elizabeth, was arrested. And remember, that's arrested with a small a, meaning taken to account, not necessarily like the police came and dragged her away. But she was arrested on account of a goldsmith for failing to pay for a gold chain she had received, not unlike the very scene in Comedy of Errors, for instance. And one more relevant point, none other than Ben Jonson himself called Rutland a genius and referred to Roger and his wife Elizabeth. Remember, she is the only daughter of the famous poet Philip Sidney. Jonson called them the poets of the Belvoir Vale, which was the name of their home seat. By the way, it's a place where James I spent 2 weeks' time not long after his coronation as king. Interesting, all of this, isn't it? You can find some of these and other details in Gililov's book, which serves as an important source for Lev's arguments. And one thing I can say at this point is that Roger Manners, Earl of Rutland, is already a far better candidate for Shakespeare than William Shakespeare of Stratford. Opponents of the Rutland theory, however, point out that the boy was just too young to have been Shakespeare. He was born in 1576. He would have only been 17 years old at Cambridge University when Venus and Adonis became the very first Shakespeare work published in 1593. Then he would have been only 18 the following year when The Rape of Lucrece was first published under the Shakespeare name. And I think that's a tough one to reconcile, but not necessarily impossible. Lev points out that Gililov, who died in 2007, is not his only source for his Rutlandianistic beliefs. I think I just invented a word there. I like to do that sometimes. He writes that in 2008, and he calls it a very large book titled The Justification of Shakespeare, was published by Russian researcher Marina Litvinova. Litvinova passed away in 2020, and there is no English translation for her book, but she put forward the idea that Rutland was working together with his tutor, Francis Bacon, to create the works of Shakespeare. Now, Lev agrees with those who doubt Bacon had the poetic talent to write the works, and it's been one of the reasons why Bacon has been pushed aside as a candidate over the decades, because none of his writing actually is anything poetic or flowery or descriptive in that type of a way. He's much more of an analytical and mechanical writer. However, Lev wonders if these two men combined could have represented the genius behind Shakespeare. That is an interesting thought, because when Rutland was first proposed as a Shakespeare candidate by Burkhard Hermann in 1906, Hermann theorized that Rutland and his dear friend Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton, were the two collaborators behind the name of Shakespeare. Of course, Stratfordians would argue that that is impossible for Rutland and Southampton to have collaborated together when obviously Southampton was spending so much time with Will Shakespeare of Stratford, which is why Shakespeare dedicated his first two works to the young Henry Wriothesley, because they obviously hung out together at the Mermaid Tavern of Essential Knowledge. Crazy. Lev credits Gililov and Litvinova with his approach to researching the mystery, and he began doing deep dives into the plays of Ben Jonson for more clues. He points out that Johnson had a penchant for satire, and Lev believes that Roger Manners' Earl of Rutland was in fact Johnson's favorite target. He believes Johnson had another favorite target in the form of Francis Bacon, and he quotes Edmund Malone, who claimed that Johnson loved to target Shakespeare. And he points that out as a means of directing that Rutland and Bacon were the men behind the Mask of Shakespeare, and Johnson knew it. Now, many of us believe that Johnson is the key to much. So we're all following along this same type of string of clues that Johnson obviously had inside knowledge and was probably pointing to what some of that knowledge was and is and has been, and that he is part of the linchpin here. Lev says, the fact is that Ben loved personal satire, and as Litvinova showed, the Earl of Rutland was his main target. At one time, Edmund Malone claimed that Johnson liked to make fun of Shakespeare, therefore we can think Rutland and Shakespeare are one and the same person. And I noticed that Ben often ridiculed not one person, but two closely related ones, and these were Rutland and Bacon. So in 2018, Lev published his book, and I won't try to say it in Russian again. I'll just give you the English title, Shakespeare, Faces, and Masks. Included in the information he sent to me are some contents of the book, which he translated into English for me. And he notes here that instead of a preface to the book, he opens it with a review of the book by Gililov, his first source of inspiration. The contents then include 11 articles, and they are, number 1, Shakespeare's Sonnets, The Riddle of Dedication; Hamlet, Changing of the Guard; Shakespeare's The Tempest, Whistle Everyone Up; Shakespeare, Faces and Masks; Shakespeare in Ben Jonson's Room of Laughter; Who's Who in Ben Jonson's play Every Man in His Humor; Shakespeare and Others in Jonson's comedy Epicene; The Alchemy of Images in Ben Jonson's play The Alchemist; The Faces of Eros, Notes on Individual Sonnets by Shakespeare; Coryat's Crudities in Russian; Rutland in Portraits, Facts and Hypotheses; and then an added feature at the end, Who Wrote Don Quixote? That's not the first time that topic has popped up here on this program either, and that's an interesting one to explore in the future as well. He also includes, of course, his various references, footnotes, etc. He notes that Articles 1, 2, and 5, so that's the first one on the sonnets, the second one on Hamlet, and the fifth one, Shakespeare in Jonson's Room of Laughter. Each of those articles were published in Russia's version of Popular Science magazine, where they were all very well received. It appears the Russians are having a far easier time these days of convincing people of the existence of a Shakespeare mystery to be solved here than those of us in the English-speaking world. And that's an interesting footnote, I think, to point out. And again, I think it has something to do with what some of our guests have elaborated on many times, which is this, English-speaking world's connection to their English-speaking writer, their father of English literature, and their inability to let go of that. Whereas other countries where people are more fluent in other languages, they tend to not have that strong-held religious faith in the Stratfordian myth, and therefore a more open mind. Also, they recognize easier that the writer of Shakespeare obviously understood, spoke, wrote, and thought in multiple languages, most likely always at the same time. After his book was published, Lev wrote another article titled On the Hidden Meaning of the Tragedy Othello by William Shakespeare, which he has also translated into English. And as I said, we will include links to his English translations on our social media pages, as well as links to his full book in Russian for anyone out there who can and wishes to read it in his native tongue. Now I want to share some highlights from Lev's work so you can get an idea of what he has been exploring and where his journey has taken him. So I'm going to begin with Shakespeare's sonnets, The Riddle of Dedication, by Lev Verkhovsky. He begins with a description of the sonnets as published in 1609, pointing out details such as its 80 pages filled with 154 sonnets and the poem at the end, A Lover's Complaint. He describes the book as having been printed on a press using well-worn letters, which he says accounts for some of the sloppiness of the book. And there are many who say it is filled with errors and misprints, and he says some of those are intentional. We've heard that before here on the program, haven't we? But that some of them involve that the printer did not have new typeset, and it was old letters, which tend to wear down over time. And so they're not meeting the paper as sharply as brand new typeset letters. And I can't even imagine what it would cost to have new typeset letters made or what the expense was at the time. But I can't imagine it was cheap. So that's an important point. He mentions the strange title page and, of course, the mysterious dedication. And he writes, "It is very strange in form. After each word, there is a period. There are no other punctuation marks. The lack of proper punctuation makes it difficult to understand, and some words and expressions by themselves cannot be interpreted unambiguously." And then as we read further, we see how a Russian language speaker interprets Elizabethan English, which, by the way, is very interesting to observe and very much in line with my premise that in order to fully understand Shakespeare, we must think in multiple languages the way that he did. And I'm looking for, and if you're out there listening, more of you who do speak multiple languages, who are fluent in different languages. I want your interpretations. I want your viewpoint on this mystery and the texts, because I think it's something that's been seriously lacking. And some of those who are considered to be the forefront of Oxfordian research only speak English. And I don't know if any of them actually speak any other language. So please contact me if you speak multiple languages and you're interested in this topic, because I'd love to hear from you. So Lev says that the perception of the word meanings in the dedication are important. So he shares his perceptions and he writes, "Thus, begetter can mean mastermind of poetry. Giver, manuscript for the publisher, and even creator as author. Only," that interesting word, O-N-L-I-E, "could mean unique in number or exceptional, wonderful in the sense of merits. The phrase in setting forth can be interpreted as flaunting them or publishing them, but also being at the point of departure, as in saying, let's hit the road, let's set forth." That's important, as you'll see when we return to it later on. He says, "As you can see, it is a rather clumsy phrase with a reverse word order uncharacteristic for English, the subject at the end, and all attempts to make it clear and smooth have so far failed." His observation of the author placing the subject at the end of the sentence only touches further upon knowing how other languages are spoken in the world different from English. And in fact, when I'm directing a Shakespeare play, my actors and I will often joke that Shakespeare was the master of what we call Yoda speak. We theorize that George Lucas modeled Yoda after a Shakespearean character. Write to me to tell me your theories about which Shakespeare character may have inspired Yoda. That's what I would love to have from you, fellow quillers. Anyway, let's get back to Lev's work. He next asks the question, who is Mr. W.H., to whom the message is addressed? Well, we all love to know the answer to that, wouldn't we? Mr., he says, is either Mr., so MR is either Mr. that is Lord, or master, which means son of a nobleman. The main contenders, by all accounts, are two nobles, William Herbert, W.H., Earl of Pembroke, and Henry Roseley, Earl of Southampton, reversed, H.W. The initials of the first are W.H. and the second is H.W. What can one say about T.T., who signed the appeal? Well, Lev points to the publisher Thomas Thorpe and gives some background info about Thorpe as a publisher. But then he asks how Thorpe could possibly find the brazen courage to address a member of the aristocracy with the inappropriate title of Mr. or Master. That's a great question. But then Lev concedes that perhaps because the addressee's name is concealed by only initials, that the inappropriate title is perhaps further subterfuge to conceal the identities of the author and the dedicatee. Nonetheless, Lev says, and I quote further, the dedication is still cryptic. Here's where Lev and I, and so many of you out there, absolutely all should agree. Lev says that in order to unravel the dedication of the sonnets, and I quote, you need to recreate the situation in which it was born, to penetrate into the intention of its creator, and this cannot be done without solving a more general problem. That problem? Finding the true Shakespeare. In his article, Lev next binds quite nicely the basic details of the authorship mystery in a concise nutshell, discrediting the Stratford myth, pointing out details most of us are all now well aware of, and highlighting the qualities of the author, which he says, and we all believe, are easily found in the text of the works. Then our international guest quotes Dostoevsky, which I just love, who once called Shakespeare, and this is true, Dostoevsky called Shakespeare, quote, a prophet sent by God to tell us the truth of the human soul. Wow. Let me repeat that. Dostoevsky called Shakespeare a prophet sent by God to tell us the truth of the human soul. Let that soak in for just a moment. Lev includes mentions of the history of the mystery and why we should be asking questions. Duh. Love him for that. And then he directs the reader's attention to Roger Manners, 5th Earl of Rutland. He includes these historical details. The first to point to Rutland in 1893 was the New York lawyer G. Ziegler. 1893. That is a full 27 years before Edward de Vere is even noticed. And then he includes some details about others who discovered Rutland along the way, including the Belgian historian Demblon, who published his book in 1912, and then Szypelinski. Szypelinski's treatise, Shakespeare equals Rutland, which was published in Moscow in 1924. And that book, Szypelinski, fellow Quillers, was approved for publication by the People's Commissar of Education, A.V. Lunacharsky, in 1924. Russia was well on its way in its Department of Education to fully accepting the dismissal of Shakespeare of Stratford as Shakespeare and embracing full exploration into a more logical truth. Incredible. And then something very terrible and very dreadful happened. Communism. Lev points out that by the 1930s, Shakespeare had been promoted in communist Russia as a man of the people, and all doubts about his identity as Shakespeare were declared, quote, ideologically vicious in the land of Soviets, which served to stifle research in this subject in Russia for the next 50 years. That fact of history does not bring me any joy. However, finding an accurate comparison between Stratfordians and even some Oxfordian elites and the Soviet regime who wish to censor areas of research that interfere with their narrative of agenda, that does make me happy. It allows the rest of us to declare that we will keep asking questions whether they like it or not. Lev describes Gililov as that type of new revolutionary who single-handedly reawakened the Shakespeare authorship mystery to fellow Russians with his book, The Game About William Shakespeare, or The Mystery of the Great Phoenix. By the way, Gililov wrote his book while serving as the scientific secretary of the Shakespeare Commission at the Russian Academy of Sciences. How's that for a credential? Lev explains that Gililov made a number of remarkable discoveries and breathed new life, as he calls it, into the hypotheses of Rutland's authorship, with the possible participation of his wife Elizabeth Sidney, also a poet, and their inner circle of aristocratic friends. The book aroused great interest, sparking many dozens of reviews and several reprints, including its English translation published in 2003. So yes, you can find Gililov's book in English, published in 2003 in that language, or you can find it in its original Russian if you can read Russian. Next came the 2008 publication Lev described as a voluminous monograph called Justification of Shakespeare, written by Marina Dmitrievna Litvinova, philologist and translator, Moscow State Linguistic University. Litvinova introduced the concept of the Rutland-Bacon pairing to create Shakespeare. She agrees with those who point to the name as a pseudonym fashioned from Pallas Athena, and like Gililov, she assigns the leading role in the partnership to Rutland. Lev quotes Vladimir Nabokov, who said, quote, Shakespeare's linguistic fabric is the highest of all that has been created in world poetry. In comparison with his poetry, his achievements in drama recede far into the background. Now, I tend to disagree with that statement, but I'm a theater artist first and foremost, so I have a tremendous bias in favor of the plays, and all of you know that. Bacon became Rutland's tutor after Rutland became a ward of William Cecil, of course, who was very well known for seeking brilliant tutors for his young wards. Bacon was just 28 years old. Rutland was 11. In 1595, Rutland went to the continent to expand his knowledge, traveled to several countries, and was eventually enrolled in the University at Padua. P.S. where some guy at the time named Galileo Galilei happened to be teaching. Yeah, that. That's just crazy, right? But it's true. When Roger, Earl of Rutland, returned to court 2 years later, he saddled up, literally, with the Earl of Essex and went off to Ireland to fight for the Queen. After the Essex Rebellion fiasco, everything hit the fan. And here's a place where I think we can all agree. After the Essex Rebellion, the works of Shakespeare dramatically changed. Pun intended. To ignore that truth is just strange. Whomever was behind the creation of the Shakespeare brand was extremely affected by the Essex Rebellion. And that's part of the puzzle, and that's part of the clue. Another thing Lev points to with regards to Rutland's life he feels is reflected in the plays is the estranged relationship that existed between Roger and his wife, Elizabeth. Lev believes further inquiry should be conducted into the couple's involvement with the writers John Donne and Ben Jonson to seek more detail about this and to get to the bottom of it all. So then, in the life of Roger Manners, Earl of Rutland, get this. On June 26, 1612, I'll note that it was almost exactly 8 years to the day after the recorded death of Edward de Vere, June 24th, 1604. On 6/26/12, Roger Manners, Earl of Rutland, dies at the young age of 35 years old. Now, some said it was syphilis that finally overcame him, and indeed he was very sickly the last few years of his life. But others said it was poison that ended him. Some claimed his wife Elizabeth killed him so she could remarry and produce a Sidney family heir. But then, when she died less than 6 weeks later, August 1st, 1612, it sparked even more rumors. Some say she was poisoned by her dead husband's allies who got their revenge on her for killing Roger before his time. Some say she died voluntarily, which could be another way of saying she committed suicide. Whatever is true there, what we do know, as Lev points out in his work, is that some of the great poets of England mourned the departure of this couple in a collection of poems that exist which were dedicated to them. Lev refers to a publication called Pluto's Helmet, and he says the publication was conspiratorial in that it had a false release date and other attributes that were confusing, not unlike some of the attributes of the first folio of 1623, for instance. And that this was a theme, that this was a thing that happened with these books and these publications and these poems and these collections, that there were these codes being put into the works and these puzzles that were specifically designed for the poet class, and that the poet class would have understood how to read them and how to decipher the clues, unlike any other class. And I should point out here that according to mythology, it was Pallas Athena who wore Pluto's helmet, which had the power to make the wearer invisible. Now, how about that? Interesting, no? Lev says Gililov managed to unravel this tangled weave, which became the starting point for his further searches, and he determined that Rutland was working incognito. He writes that some powerful forces closely followed the preservation of secrets, purposefully creating a myth about the authorship of the man from Stratford who would become, for centuries, a living mask of the true author. But why was it necessary? The answer must be sought in the peculiarities of the era and specific people. It was the Renaissance, the return of ancient wisdom, liberation from medieval dogmas, but also religious wars, witch hunts, and dissidents. For instance, in 1600, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in Rome. In such an atmosphere, many authors prefer to remain anonymous and make their texts allegorical. Excellent points. He goes on. Bacon wrote that great truths should remain hidden, and he was especially concerned with ciphers. Bacon's main goal was to reorganize the state on a scientific basis for which he needed to take a high post in it. An open fascination with literature would interfere with his career, and he talked about the secret order of the helmet. Pallas Athena, usually depicted in a helmet, and according to legends, this is Pluto's magic helmet, making everyone who wore it invisible. Bacon's words, according to Lev, were, be one person when you are dealing with nature and another when you are dealing with people. Anyone who has the highest understanding puts on a mask when communicating with them. Love it. Fast forward to Lev's next position. In 1611, a large, well-published volume appears entitled Coriat's Crudities, written by Thomas Coryat of Oddcombe, which, by the way, is a tiny, tiny little place with a population of less than 500 people or something like that. He was referred to as the Prince of Poets, the greatest pedestrian in the world. And Lev says that Coryat is the real face of the jester of the Crown Prince Henry, son of James I. The book describes the Oddcombians' journey through Europe, and the first 120 pages were occupied by poetic panegyrics, which is a mixture of praise and ridicule, addressed to him by 56 authors, among whom were the most prominent people of the kingdom. Now, Lev believes Gililov also revealed this as a literary hoax. Rutland was hiding behind the mask of Coryat. He was not averse to laughing at others and at himself, and that the entire edition is a grandiose Rabelaisian farce, a feast of satire and humor. As stated in the preface, Coryat left London in May 1608, and in October of that year he returned after visiting 45 cities and covering mostly on foot a journey of almost 2,000 miles. Rutland had traveled, but he did not leave England that year. His legs hurt, and at times he's reported to have been moved around the house in a wheelchair. This could have been symptoms of his advanced syphilis. He could have, though, used his impressions of his stay on the continent from the 90s, as well as the news that friends still there was sent to him regularly, to include in his book. And the book contains a lot of valuable and factual information about Europe of the time, and especially about Venice. With these foundations now laid, Lev returns to the dedication of the sonnets. He notes that Catherine Duncan Jones pointed out that the dedication is reminiscent of how the ancient Romans wrote on their gravestones in capital letters and with a period after each word. Marina Litvinova writes that Rutland knew this. Coryat, in his opus, admitted that he copied many such epitaphs, for which he was even nicknamed Pedestrian Gravestone, making a connection between the sonnets and Coryat's crudities. Also, the sonnets were being prepared for printing at the same time when the work on the adventures of Coryat was in full swing. Lev argues they were in the center of attention of the entire poetic community all at once, and that this fact could be reflected in the initiation, which he says is a secret message intended only for their own kind, that dedication page. He says it is known that the title pages of books in the Renaissance were often used to encrypt important messages, and that the drawings and the text on them made up a real puzzle, which only a select few, that poet class, were able to solve. He likes to highlight, as many have before, the geometric shapes on the sonnet's dedication, and he calls that visual poetry. It's sort of like an E.E. Cumming poem of sorts, if you look at it from a modern perspective. And Lev asks us to rearrange the shapes in reverse order to cipher their meaning. Then he points out that the two potential dedicatees were connected to Rutland in supreme ways. There is no doubting the relationship between Southampton and Rutland, a la the Essex Rebellion and other accounts of their very close friendship. And the Earl of Pembroke was Elizabeth Sidney's cousin and was known to have helped in orchestrating her marriage to Roger Manners, Earl of Rutland. Is he then Earl of Pembroke? Meaning, is the Earl of Pembroke then the only instigator of these sonnets, which have a theme about this love triangle relationship between the poet, the fair youth, and the dark lady, a wife he never really loved? That is a question worth asking with regards to the Rutland position. And if Rutland is the author, it lends stronger credibility to the idea that the sonnets are all a bunch of love triangle poems involving homosexual love affairs and trysts of various sorts. Now, Litvinova agrees the dedication looks more like a Roman epitaph. Very ominous. If Rutland is the author of the sonnets, they would have been published just 3 years before his death, a death he was aware was coming sooner than later due to his affliction, and he may have been preparing to hit the road, as Lev puts it, and that's what the dedication implies. He goes on to say that Litvinova establishes the rival poet to be John Donne, who was very tied to the Manners husband and wife team. And as we know, Roger and Elizabeth were not happily married, and perhaps John Donne was her lover, which creates then a love quadrangle in the sonnets between 4 people: the writer, his male lover, his wife whom he doesn't love, and a rival poet who is filling in the gaps where he is not fulfilling his husbandly duties. He also ponders, as others have, whether there may be more than one voice in the sonnets, meaning that some of the sonnets may have been written as sort of secret letters back and forth between the parties represented. So the characters would be Roger Manners, his male lover, Henry Roseley, his wife, Elizabeth Sidney, and the rival poet, John Donne. And these sonnets dedicated to the Earl of Pembroke, who orchestrated this whole fiasco when he orchestrated the marriage of Roger and Elizabeth. That's the premise, gang. Boris Pasternak noted that Shakespeare left a deeper personal imprint on his writings than anyone before or after him, meaning that the true identity of the writer is in there somewhere. And so then Lev asks this question: do not such investigations violate the author's will to remain unknown forever? And he answers his own question with no. This is how everything was intended. He has hidden himself, but not completely, leaving many clues that should allow future generations to recognize him. And Lev concludes by saying, we live in a momentous time. Humanity is finding Shakespeare. Isn't that exciting, fellow Quillers? I think so. Now, as I've mentioned, we will be sharing links to Lev's English translations of some of the articles in his book, as well as a link to the full text in its original Russian. We will also place a link where you can find the English translation of Gililov's book so that you can journey down the Rutlandian path if you so choose. There's a lot to unpack here, and I'd say at the very minimum, some of Lev's questions and points further demonstrate why there is a valid mystery here. How impossible it is that the Stratford man could have ever been the writer, and how clear it is that the writer or writers were enmeshed in the intrigues and broils and scandals of the Elizabethan and Jacobean courts. Investigation into Rutland, Bacon, Southampton, De Vere, the Sidneys, the Pembrokes, the Earl of Essex, they may not yet have fully identified the true author or authors behind the pseudonym of Shakespeare, but each of these paths wind up landing inside the same general circle of targets who were all connected together in this incestuous pool of the English nobility, and they all have connections to writing and poetry in some way. All of that evidence far overshadows the absolute absence of any literary evidence linking the Stratford man to any literary life. The deeper we dive into the relationships between the members of this circle of courtiers, the closer we will get to the truth. And I want to thank Lev Verkhovsky for agreeing to allow me to share some of his work with you. And I want to thank you, fellow Quillers, for continuing this journey with us here at Don't Quill the Messenger. I'd like to remind you that you can find out more about today's episode, the research and writings of our previous guests, special bonus feature episodes, and more at our Patreon page, which you can access from the homepage of our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. It's a nice red button there. It says Patreon. Click on that, take you right to the feed and all the information that you want that's there. The social media feed there is free and open to all, but you can also learn there how to support the show, how to unlock our growing library of bonus material, and how to qualify for our Quiller of the Month drawing. And with that said, let me shout out to this month's Quiller of the Month, Quiller Clare Jaget, all the way from the Turks and Caicos Islands. Congratulations, Clare, and thank you for being a loyal Quiller. I hope you enjoy your free Quiller swag item. Remember, friends, you too can show off your Quiller pride with a Quiller swag item from our shop. Truthfully, honestly, I have to tell you, there's very little revenue generated from our swag shop after the costs of the item and shipping. But we sure do love it when we know that an order has gone out, because it means that you're out there showing off your Quiller pride to others. So why not do that? Get a shirt or a coffee mug, and then why not email us a photo or post a photo to our social media feeds of you proudly wearing your Quiller t-shirt or enjoying a hot beverage from a Quiller coffee mug. We'd love to see your smiling Quiller faces. So think about that and shoot us a shot of you. It could be a selfie. Do a selfie. Post it on our Facebook page or to our Patreon page, or just email it to me and I'll post it in all the forums. Also, don't forget to keep those emails coming with comments, questions, and suggestions as well. Just write to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com, contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. And some of you have discovered that there is no apostrophe in don't in the website address and in the email address. So contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. That's all for now, fellow Quillers. So join me once again, Quiller Nation. Until next time, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.